Thank you all so much for coming. It's great to have so many of you here. For those of you that haven't been at the conference today, you've missed an absolutely fantastic day, as hopefully those of you that have been here will agree. And there are still tickets available for tomorrow. If you'd like to book, do please think about that. So we're really delighted, as part of this conference, to have Annie here as our keynote speaker. So a lot of Annie's work has been informed by working with specialists in neuroscience, meteorology, engineering, psychiatry, and the history of science. And I think she's particularly interested in the parallels and connections that can be drawn between art, science, and the poetic. So really an ideal person to be speaking to us this evening. So Annie's originally from Glasgow, studied at the School of Art there, as well as at the University of Ulster and the Royal College of Art in London, where she's been a tutor since 2000, as well as lecturing in many other art colleges around the UK and overseas. She's a Royal Scottish Academician and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Sculptors. She's exhibited nationally and internationally, and her work is held in numerous public collections, and there's one small example of that. You can see a lovely drawing by her in our exhibition outside. And she's also undertaken many large-scale public art commissions, and I know we're going to be hearing a bit about some of those later on. So please join me in welcoming Annie Cattrell.
Well, it's a real honour to be doing this at this time of the day after all so many amazing talks, so thought-provoking. This is an artist talk. It's not an academic talk, so it's just to set that up to begin with. And I was just reminded of coming here how I have a bit of history with Dundee, and that is that a long time ago I had a dual show with Ruth Saxon in what was called the Seagate then, which was a very positive experience. Also, I have a couple of works which I'll show you, but one of them anyway, are in the McManus collection. So I have a fondness for Dundee, which is very nice to have had that support. And recently I was external on the BA. So the talk's called Everything is Connected, which has been a kind of theme that's run through a lot of my ideas and thinking, actually mainly as a result of COVID, but also simply as a way of kind of tying a project which I'm going to talk about at the very end, what I'm doing right now, about that idea of connectivity. But hopefully you'll see that I've embedded these ideas throughout the talk. And I wanted to just kind of read out, not exactly a statement, but kind of where I come from as an artist. I have often worked in art schools, and I have had proper contracts in art schools and actually left some of them. So I'm kind of mainly freelance. So when you see some of the projects, they're not all. I'm not showing them all chronologically. I'm just showing them as I feel fit today. And some of them relate to geology, and some of them are inside the body, which has been really interesting to see what other people's research and their 3D modelling of that, and all the kind of courses that run now. But I would consider myself a multidisciplinary artist, and when I say that, I know a lot of people say interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. I think it's just trying to give myself the freedom to do whatever I want, whenever I want, and I really don't like being labelled or having boundaries set. There are certain constraints of making a living, but I like to feel that I can invent myself whenever I feel like reinvent. My focus is informed by acts of paying attention, and I think that's particularly relevant for me anyway, thinking of Geddes, and noticing, contemplating and watching. At times it seems almost forensic, and that was interesting seeing the kind of 3D modelling of the forensic today. And I'm drawn to discrepancies and inaccuracies, seeing if and when structures, patterns or meaning can emerge. So it's about what it isn't as well as what it is, in order to kind of identify. I remember one time doing a project at Lewisham Hospital, talking to a histologist who was looking for cancer cells, and he said he was just scanning, his eyes were scanning for inaccuracies or patterns of change. And I found that really moving, actually, and I was conscious when we were talking about that kind of idea of the deep texture of being somewhere and doing something earlier on. Some people were mentioning that. Part of this process involves observing subtle topographical changes in, say, the landscape or atmosphere, fluctuations, weather conditions, or more intimately inside the human body and brain. I constantly take photographs, film as a way of recording and thinking aloud and making visual notes. In the studio, I cast, assemble, fuse, weld, etch using techniques in bronze, glass, wood, many other appropriate materials. This brings the ideas into form and structure. So it's a language of sorts. New digital approaches have led me to explore new state-of-the-art technologies, for example, LiDAR scanning, fMRI scanning, and so forth. So I'm really interested in all of the new technologies. And working part-time in the RCA, I'm always kind of looking for new technologies and talking to people who are doing that. So the reason why I put this image up comes from a time in 2000 when I was artist in residence in the Royal Institution, and it seemed appropriate today given what happened a year ago in Ukraine, because this was actually an electron tree, which, if any of you know what they're like, they're these kind of I've just written down what it was, visible patterns of deformation using electron currents through a low conductive materials such as acrylic. So this shape comes from that process, and this was actually acrylic, and I took it into my brother's darkroom and did a photogram of it, and it was given as a gift. Okay, it's beautiful, but it was given as a gift from a Russian scientist to somebody in the Royal Institution during the Cold War, and it seemed to represent that kind of gift of what can happen. And also, I think you can kind of make this out, there's lots of scratches and so forth, and that felt, I'm sure they weren't there to begin with, not that I'm suggesting anybody added the scratches, but it was the wear and tear of life. So anyway, that's one thought for today and why I put that picture up. So yes, I was Leverhulme artist in residence at Royal Institution when I was a child in the 60s and 70s in Edinburgh. I would watch the Christmas lectures on the BBC and be absolutely fascinated by them. So it was a great honour to be their first artist in residence. They'd have associations with lots of other artists, but it was the first time they'd had an artist in residence. So this is what it was like. I was given the key. It was on Albemarle Street in London. It was extraordinary. 2000, Faraday Lecture Theatre. These were some of the things that happened behind the scenes, which felt to me a little bit like being in an art school. So this kind of this one is Bryson Gore, who was a science communicator who used to do all sorts of things and put light bulbs in his mouth, and you know, they'd light up and he'd touch things, and it was terrifying, but it was really exciting at the same time. So it was fun, it was exciting. He was doing lectures for children as I'd watched as a child myself. And the one on the right is a bubble raft, and what that is actually in an old overhead projector. There's a sort of tank of water with bubbles, soap bubbles, very liquid ones, for want of a better product. And it would show how they would want to move together, and there was a surface tension. And I like that sense of, I suppose, what I would call the poetic. It's the reduced right down, the kind of essence of something, the something which is actually that vital moment when something has happened, when something can be identified. So I met various people there, including a meteorologist called Stan Cornford. And I ended up getting very interested in ways of measuring, how scientists use measurements. And these are very analog. These are ones that you'd find, say, on a farm, or there's one in actually Orkney that I came across when I was doing a residency up there. And what it is, it's a sphere of glass that is orientated in such a way that it burns a line onto this paper here, which is the bit there, and each day they put a new paper in, and it makes an index of the sunshine, not just sunlight, it's got to be sunshine. So probably Dundee's ones would be very, very, according to the meteorology here. But anyway, so it gives this kind of very, very particular code of sunshine on a particular day. And I made a piece of work when I was doing the Barrett Gymnasium Fellowship, which was 64 days of sunshine up to the longest day. I just transferred that data, very interested in my lack of touch with that piece. I didn't want to kind of fiddle around with it. I just wanted to re-represent it. And that's a kind of theme that has run through a lot of my work. It's not necessarily that I feel, and that it's how far do you take it? So these are basically those strips, and they're cut through. I think you can see them. Sorry, the slides aren't as good as they might be, but and it became this kind of code of the sunshine on each given day. And they're just cut through aluminium sheets. And on the back, the people who were cutting it for me with a laser just put the date on the back. And I quite like the randomness of them just marking it out with a Sharpie. So this is what it looked like. And I called it aperture, and I think it was kind of thinking about how we experience the world through light, and also it was shown in the area the data was picked, it was selected from the area in which it was found, as it were, or gathered. So there was one or two which had no sunshine, and this one had just a tiny bit. And I was really interested, one of the women who was looking at my work was looking at one of the sheets, and she noticed the date behind it, and she was from the local area, and she started to be quite tearful, and I said, "You're right," you know, and in a nice way. And, you know, and she said, "No, I have seasonal affective disorder." So she said that actually staring at this sheet of stainless steel was bringing back that memory of that day. And I thought, how powerful is that this data can have that effect, or the transformation of this data. Anyway, I went on to start to kind of recreate, thinking of meteorological ideas, and this lower left piece, these are actually very small foils. Which I was working with Stan Cornford in the 60s. He was he predicted the weather for the BBC, and one of the things he did was, for his research, was he tried to kind of anticipate the inside of a cloud, so to speak. So he made a probe that went outside of a plane, and these are the indents of those clouds. So they're little tiny casts of cloud droplets. And I find it really inspiring. He gave me one from the year of my birth. No particular significance there. It was just kind of meaningful to me. But it was also, I suppose, the idea of being there, being inside a cloud, seeing it from that perspective. So I started to do lots of photographs in the dark with flash photography, and these became light boxes. And then I was commissioned to make a piece for the V&A London, and it was in a show called Out of the Ordinary. And that idea of cloud formation and the transience of clouds, and the fact I was kind of also thinking of the idea that the clouds have no, although they're affected by obviously the heat of the land and the ecosystem, they also float, they can be floating above Paris and then be over London and then be up over Edinburgh or Dundee. So there's no sort of boundaries in a way. And I quite like that fluidity of the water and that kind of navigating around the world, as it were. So this is actually me imagining, they're not accurate, they're not taken from NASA. I did look into that, getting data from NASA, but they're me imagining three-dimensional clouds inside tracks so that you can see them and compare them. So I don't know how easy it is to see. They're basically 40 centimetres high, 15 by 15 centimetres, about 25 kilos each. They're glass, they're subsurface etched inside them, and they are meant to kind of reflect cloud formation in a year in London. And I was looking at the Constable paintings in the V&A and sort of looking at his observations of clouds. And I suppose clouds by their very essence are in a state of transit, they're transitory. So I was trying to kind of capture that a bit, and I was hoping that when people came out of the V&A, they might look up rather than down. I'm not sure if that worked, but I didn't do a questionnaire or anything. Anyway, so these are them close up. These are more clear, I think. Yeah, it's a subsurface etching process, which I can talk to anybody about if they want to. There's no point in doing it within this time frame. But suffice to say, it's done with lasers, and it fractures the inside of a block of optical glass. So this one here particularly is a cross-section, is a close-up of January, which was a nod to my roots in Edinburgh and the Har, very, very low-level kind of cloud formation. So I've benefited from quite a few RSA residencies and opportunities, which is great, and I think they're open. You don't have to be a Royal Academician to get one, Royal Scottish Academician to get one. But anyway, so I went up to Orkney. I was hosted by the Peer Arts Centre and working with the Herrick-Watt University as well. And I was looking at the way that the wave power is actually tidal, and wave power is being researched up there. and they were very accommodating and helpful. And I was really struck by, again, like the clouds, that sort of transitory that nature, that all this kind of water can come in between Orkney and the mainland Scotland. And you can see the arrows, which are the scientists' modelling of the behaviour of the water during the day. And then alongside that, this photograph, courtesy of Kirkwall Library, is just there to be handled and touched. And it's actually the Murdo Mackenzie map, and it was an Admiralty map. So his whole reason for doing it was for ships coming in. So it was that vantage point of coming in from the sea, rather than actually necessarily coming in as we do now on planes and so forth. Obviously, it was done of its time, but so he talked to a lot of people who were locals and found all that information out about kind of how to navigate, basically. And I like the words like cod and ling here, you know, just inside information that you'd only get from somebody who was...
Is that his own words?
Sorry?
Is that his own words?
I think he was talking to the fishermen.
Oh, right, okay, got it.
I'm assuming they were men, but you know, that they knew that's where they went to fish at that time. Yeah. So I had a show there called Fathom. Got some catalogues there here, if anybody's interested later on, with a nice so with a Stephen Connor and an interesting essay. So this is shown out in the Peer Arts Centre. It was a piece I made in London, not during the residency, but it was as a result of doing the residency that I made this piece. And I was sort of modelling the sea, not with technologies or anything, just with my hands, with clay, and then vacuum forming them. And the idea, I think, was bringing the outside in so that you could see something in a way that you couldn't see it normally, because it was in a constant state of flux and movement. And I was slightly worried when I was suggesting putting it in this space, because you can see the water out there, and I thought it was difficult to imagine that comparison working. But actually, oddly, because of the pier there, it was actually really interesting. It wasn't, and when people who were looking at the piece, you move around it, it kind of moves. It doesn't physically move, but because of the undulations, the light makes it move, as it were, or appear to move. And on the opening night, the outside, the frequency was kind of similar. Oddly, it was quite rough outside. It's a harbour there, so it's quite still in this photograph. And these are sort of close-ups of it. So it was from memory, but it was as a result of observing water, taking photographs. I didn't have an iPhone in those days, so I was just trying to kind of gather information, and then from that I would model them. And I would be in the middle of this kind of, I wish I had some photos, but of this kind of huge, big bed-like area of clay, where I kind of, it was quite sort of performative in a way. It's interesting. And with that idea of water and air and elemental capacity, I made a series of these. And one actually was originally in the Miracles Show exhibition in the Edinburgh Festival, curated by Rose Frayne, I think it was about 1998. But this is actually one I've made just in the 2000s, which was kind of a larger version, and it's always been on show. It's a strange thing. One of the most fragile pieces I've ever made. It's always been kind of moving around the world in some way, and so packaging it is such a big deal. It's in Australia at the moment, but it's also, I've made another iteration which is going into the Hepworth quite soon if anybody's down that way. And I think what interested me is the materiality of it. The organ of air is made by air. That esophagus is actually made by blowing into the glass tubing and manipulating it with air. It became Channel 4 invited me to show it during COVID times, and I had a kind of negotiation with them when I said it must not be seen as a model, it needs to be seen as a piece of sculpture, and we couldn't really get to the bottom of that. So I didn't show it. I just thought, well, there's plenty of nice, fantastic models, you know. So this is it close up. So it's transparent glass with the shadow very, in a way, more visually prominent than the actual piece. And I've suspended it in such a way that it feels like it's floating, so it adds to that kind of sense of lifting up. And it came from looking at going to Guy's Hospital and looking at the anatomy, the corrosion casts there. And that's another piece that was shown alongside it, called Process, the alimentary canal. So just the idea that we are just a tube, and that's how we begin, and we absorb things and then we reject them, so to speak, through our body, and it happens hopefully without any kind of consciousness of it happening, or otherwise there's something wrong. But thinking about the way that scientists also use glass, and how that that test tube making was part of this thinking as well. And I've been working, and I'm working right now with neuroscientists. This was a cast I made of the inside of the skull that I borrowed from Guy's Hospital. So it's the top of the skull, and then that part is the positive of the skull. So actually when you see them at close proximity, these are actually kind of quite look like they're bulging. So it's between the skull and the meniscus. It's that section there. And normally you see representations of brains, but I was really interested in the idea of the index from the inside of the skull. So almost like those rivulets, that dendritic growth formation that happens, the pressure of the vessels in your brain that actually have an impact on the actual rigidity or the hardness of the skull. So I've worked with Morton on a lot of projects. He's at Lineker College, and he's a neuroscientist, and he also works at RSA in Denmark. He's from Denmark. He's a professor there. And I've got a kind of slightly tenuous fellowship there, not because I don't want to be there, it's just I've got too many other things going, and so has he. But we've marked it down as something we're going to do in the future, because they've got a very interesting research group. And his interest, apart from anything else, is in hedonia and anhedonia. So the feelings of pleasure and then the feelings of lack of pleasure, which is as experienced through depression and so forth. So some of the people he's working with, who are his PhD students, are doing experimentation with mushrooms and so forth, which is very much in the news right now. I think it's cybersilience, is it? Anyway, so to sort of bring people back into a sense of well-being. So we've done a lot of projects together, and we've been, partly him driving it, been in a lot of publications. So this one's LA Architectural Journal, and then that's one of his books which has been translated into Danish. And these, that's a close-up. And from those discussions, I've watched brain surgery and done various pieces of work with him. And that's a close-up, sorry, it should have been in the previous slide, of from within, so you can see those kind of intense, the intensity of the vessels. And then the top right one, there are a few pictures of surgery coming up, just to warn you. And I became really interested in the analog and the digital in relationship to the body, and people have been speaking about that so well today, and all those kind of ethical issues as well about going inside the body. But one of the things that really interested me in terms of the surgery was the top right one, which is essentially a process where you can identify the shape and the blood flow to a tumour in the brain before you even open somebody's head up in order to kind of take it out. So I have watched a lot of surgery, and these are some of the images. I got permission every time, and I've watched Henry Marsh. Well, I wasn't allowed to take photographs. I don't know if you know him, but he's really interesting, written all sorts of books, one called Do No Harm, which is really interesting to read about his experience as a surgeon. But this was watching, the brain surgery in the Radcliffe Hospital, where Morton goes in and works with patients as well. He's not a surgeon. And also brain they call them cut-ups. So this is actually in the brain bank in Hammersmith Hospital. It's people donate their brains in order to try to, I suppose, if they've died, and some of these people have, of dementia and Alzheimer's and so forth, to try and help that research. So I've had my own brain scanned, which was part of my art budget. Yes, there was one in there, and so it was kind of interesting looking at yourself. And this was about 20 years ago. I know it's much more common now, but it was interesting for me to do that. I had to have a disclaimer that if I found something that And I made this piece with Morton, but this was about the activated areas in the brain, when a person is experiencing the 5 senses. So I offered myself as a guinea pig to the Radcliffe, and so I went into and various things. They're not. I had no choice in what those experiences were, but one of them was sucking chocolate for taste, and seeing was looking at the checkerboard. But you know, it would be nice to be able to go in and have something like an artwork and so forth. But anyway, I was one of many for their research purposes, and this is. So that's seeing, smelling, hearing, touching and tasting, and those are the kind of volumes within the brain of those senses. It's an amalgam, it's not just mine. And this was first shown during my residency at the Royal Institution, and these are some close-ups, seeing and hearing. And I was interested in the fact that they just looked like, if you didn't know the context, you wouldn't have known what on earth they were. They could have looked like a lava lamp, they could have looked like anything. And quite a lot of the scientific community said to me, oh, are you going to add the brain in? And I'm going, no, that's the point, the whole brain is taken out, and it's actually more to do with the idea that the brain is in a constant state of flux and movement and change, and it's actually much more to do with that kind of 3 internal mapping. And that's it shown at the pier. And that's it in Freiburg. So shown quite differently. And in different contexts, some people thought they were more like a kind of portrait. This is Morton again with his pleasure centre, and we've had lots of kind of different ways of this has been disseminated. It was bought by the Wellcome, or one of the iterations was, and it ended up in a very, I thought, highbrow kind of studies in history and philosophy of biological and biomedical sciences, which, you know, as an artist, I never imagined that. And I kind of really value the fact that the scientists take it so seriously. Actually, it's meaningful to me. It's been very useful at certain times when I've had academic posts for research excellence framework. But it's also nice to see that they take it, you know, that it's actually valued. And recently, this was in the Brain Art and Knowledge in Bonn, and they've donated the piece because they're changing their system at the Wellcome now to the Charity Museum in Berlin. And this is another piece, Pleasure Pain, to do with the activation of the brain. This is rapid prototype taken from various activations within the brain when somebody's experienced both pleasure and pain. And that's it. Martin Kemp wrote an article for Nature. So I'm just going to show you some projects which are the public artwork that I do, which enables me to do a much larger scale, which I couldn't possibly do if I was working in the studio. And this one's called Not 10,000, and it was commissioned for the biochemistry department at Oxford University. I was given a space to make a suspended piece in, and that kind of gave it a parameter, a spatial parameter, but it was huge. It was like 10 meters by 15 by so-and-so. And I came up with this title because I wanted to make something which was about transformation. That was the space, and it was based on the idea of plasma, which is the 4th state of matter, and that idea of something in a constant state of it's not a solid, liquid or a gas, and it related to the temperature of the sun. So this is me. I had that space. I thought of all sorts of things I could have put in it, and in the end I thought, well, I guess air inside could be related to where birds might live, possibly. And so I got some birds online, scanned them at the RCA. You can see the dots, so that 3D scanning, manipulated them with the help of Rodrigo Solenzano, who helps me do the 3D modelling, and then I cast them in resin, which is suspended. And at first glance it looks like a very kind of nice flock of birds, but actually when you look closer you can see that some of them are kind of back to back and they're moving into each other. So it was kind of a critique about as well as a optimistic view of what science can do, and just that hesitancy of whether or not we have to be careful ethically and so forth. And this is it being installed, and the bottom right is the photovoltaic cells on the ceiling. And I really like the fact that it almost gave a kind of grid-like structure when you looked up. because I think in a way science is, we always look to science for answers now, which is very good at giving on certain occasions, but it can't give every answer to every problem in the world. However, they do feel a little bit like these new buildings, like the new cathedrals. And these are some of the publications that went with that, and some of the press that went along it within the Independent. So there was a lot of interest in the whole kind of project. If anybody's interested, I can provide the scans of these so you can read them at your length. But I just wanted to put them in to show you the kind of breadth of dissemination of the work, that it goes from kind of an Italian publication to to Nature, to an architectural one. So I just wanted to talk a bit about other work outside, because I don't distinguish between inside the body and inside the world, inside the earth crust or on the surface of it. I think they're all skins. And it's sort of, I find them, So I was asked to make an application to the Forest of Dean, and I made this piece and I got it, and I do tend to do a lot of research before I come up with a final idea. So I spent a lot of time up there looking at the culture of the Forest of Dean, looked at the LiDAR scans that they'd done, the Forestry Commission. I think any area they're responsible for, they've got scans of that. So I looked at that and thought, could I use that? I'd been using them with the brain work. Would that be appropriate? I found this quarry, which was 310 million years old, and it had originally in the Super-Pangea been down on the Mediterranean and moved very slowly up to between England and Wales. And I thought, how extraordinary, apart from anything else, that it was in this state of transition for such a long time. But in the end, we scanned it with a LiDAR scanner, and I manipulated it in the studio, and then I just decided to work with the team to cast it. And so that casting was portioning out the space. It had to go through all sorts of process of making sure there wasn't any bats and so forth roosting in there. And that's it. So this is called Echo, which is in the Forest of Dean, and that's it. So the front side was cast in resin with aluminium dust in it, and the other side was almost like the back. If you think about the piece from within with the skull, it's exactly the same piece. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, it's just on a much larger scale. And actually what I found myself once I made this, because I couldn't imagine what the positive of a negative would be, I found this side far more interesting. The other side replicated what was behind it and where it had come from, but this side made you feel as though you were inside something. And I think you can just see that hole that was up, where the tree protruded on the other side. You see it there on the left, became an aperture, and so you could look up to the sky. I've made a piece which is based on ideas of the Brand Seer. Forgive the picture on the left, but I thought what was interesting was it had an adder stone in it, and there's one there. So that tradition of looking into the future through stone, and how that gives you a kind of aperture and a focus in a very particular way. The reason why I'm putting this in was because they asked me to make something for the young people, essentially, younger generations in Inverness. So I cast the rocks either side of Loch Ness here. And yes, we had the police turn up, and I was almost arrested, and we did have permission, and people thought we were. It was soon after. Anyway, it was an issue. People thought we were painting it pink, and it wasn't. But we left it as we found it. The moulds came off, and then these are the pieces. One of which was the first iteration of which I made 2 casts, and it was Callum Colvin from here. Curated art and poetry for the RSA Royal Academy Annual that year, and that was my first attempt to use those moulds, which are quite big actually. I mean, I think they're 8 foot high as far as I recall. And he teamed me up with a poet called Rab Wilson, and I've just put that at the bottom because it's on my Instagram. I'm not trying to get a load of followers or anything. Just if you want to listen to Rab reciting it. It's on the 5th of the 5th, 2018, and Rab is doing it at the opening, and he's doing it in Scottish. I needed an English translation, which was So it was a kind of, not an ode to my work, but it was a discussion that we had. And I love that kind of idea that we could have this discussion. And he'd been doing a residency in Glasgow with an astrophysicist, I think it was. So there was all sorts of connections. We didn't even meet, we were doing it by phone. So that's where it is in Inverness. And the idea is that in a way you complete it. You activate it by touching either side. You become that kind of space between, which essentially would be where Nessie would be. But it's it's like the idea that you can make that connection, which for some people could sound corny, but for other people it's actually quite. I found it quite significant in terms of like bringing those tectonic plates together and actually making a human bridge, so to speak. So a part of that body of work is inspired by looking at James Hutton's work, his theory of the Earth, and how he basically, although when he was alive, I don't think it was fully disseminated, but Playfair took it up and ran with it a bit more, and then somebody else made it much more public. But it was quite problematic at the time because he basically was saying that the world was a lot older than was thought of in terms of the religious understanding of the world. But his famous quote is, "There's no vestige of a beginning and no prospect of an end." So by looking at Sicker Point and other places, Hutton's section on Arthur's Seat, by just observing and understanding the formation of the rocks, he was able to see that the world was a lot older and prove it in a sense. And I really liked that. And I was invited to apply for a competition from Sky Arts, representing one of the people representing Scotland, and so I cast Sicker Point because it seemed the most important thing to do at the time. It was post-COVID, and so that's the moment of actually there where my profiler is, and this is me doing a sort of test cast on the beat, which was quite rough in terms of working there. And this is the piece which was show and control last year in the Hutton Institute in Aberdeen. I know you've got one nearby. So it was, again, a bit like Echo. The top was the direct cast, and this is the underneath. So it feels like it's actually rising up, and it's just standing on a few points. So it looks very, very light. It's very difficult to see how it's standing. And that's it with more sort of dramatic light. It's actually in the boardroom. It was in the boardroom at Hutton Institute, hence the interesting curtains behind and so forth. But I was really pleased it was there because it felt that it was so relevant, and they were very engaged with me showing it there. And that's it on the ground. You can see how, and that's Denise Mina, and it was installed at the House of the Art Lover. I'll go past this one. This is a piece I made for Bristol University, thinking about how we use models, but also what would happen, because it was the School of Engineering, what would happen if we pulled the landmass out, which in a sense is floating anyway, and actually made that larger and receded it back, so that you became conscious of where things fitted together like a sort of jigsaw puzzle. And these are the 3D renderings that I did, and I'm still working on this piece now. It's actually it's not complete. I mean, it's complete in it's the fact that it's installed in Bristol, but it's not complete in my mind. I want to go back to it, and that's it suspended in the space. Finally, this is a piece that was in Oxford. Sorry, I was going to say Oxford Biochemistry. No, John Brooks at Oxford, and they asked me to make a suspended piece, and I was and it was between the lecture theatre and actually the library, and I thought, what would that space be? Because it's almost like the space, in my mind, between the two tectonic plates. In a way, it's like you have the lectures, and then you have the library, and it's all about that knowledge and what happens. And it's a very international university, as so many are now. But I was imagining what it would be like what happens when cognition takes place. What does it feel like? What is it that moment when the penny drops? What it looked like. So this is not my GIF, but I like it. And it was almost about that kind of resonating out, which is the name of the piece. And whole section. I mean, my studio in London is relatively small, so I had to do this all virtually, and this is the suspended piece virtually worked. And it's a sort of combination of the moment the droplet goes down or the penny drops, and then a kind of an acoustic horn that so that's hence it being called resounding. And it was made of lots of many pieces, lots of prep. Iggy Pop on the left there, I don't know if you can see him. I was working with Steve Haynes, who I understand one of his daughters has worked up here in the forensic lab, B. Haynes. And this was us taking it, so that's the top bit that it was suspended from, quite large. This is us installing, and that's it coming down. And that's it. When you stand in the middle, you're almost in the middle of a kind of vortex, as it were. And I was really pleased at the opening of the building, because the building was opening at the same time as the piece had been finished. Baroness Helena Kennedy was there and kind of impromptually made reference to the work as a kind of, not exactly a metaphor, but as perhaps a symbol of that process of the idea of echo resounding, something which suggests more possibilities, has a kind of resonance. I think that's probably as far as I can go within the time frame. Sorry, I could go on for a lot longer, but I think it's 5:15, isn't it? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Gosh, what fantastic, wonderful, rich presentation there. Are you happy to take questions?
Yeah, what I wanted to do, but just to show what's involved. I've got a couple of films. One is, can you do that? Yeah. What I wanted to say at the very end actually was, please get in touch if you've got any questions or whatever, or if you're interested in anything further, or something occurs to you. This is us installing that day, or a couple of days actually in Oxford Brookes. What was quite interesting about the piece was when it was being installed, there was all sorts of tweeting going on. It was 2015, I think it was, that sort of spaceship had landed and all the rest of it. So it kind of triggered people's imaginations as well. And people would sit and eat their lunch and watch it happening. And I like that too. I think it's great. In a way, that's why my work, my practice has gone into this kind of public art realm, is that I actually feel quite strongly in a way that I really enjoy, not people clapping and saying that's nice, but more that the art is somehow integrated into a space and hopefully triggers thought and is interesting through time, and provides questions as much as not exactly answers, but questions.
Where did you procure the technical support?
Oh, that's part of the budget. You see, these people who are up there, I have vertigo, but these people were ex-firemen, trapeze artists,
Oh, right.
amazing people. They were so fantastic. You'll be glad to know I did take them out for a meal at the end of it all.
I believe
But
it.
nobody was drinking throughout the whole time, because we had to come in we had to come in at 5 to start. I think it was in March, so to start doing it, because people were studying as well. That's the library, that's the lecture theatre. The lecture theatre was very acoustically, that was fine, but the library
I
was...
can tell it was still, because that's some height for that normal technicians wouldn't do that.
No, they're called Flints, the company.
Right,
Flints. Do you know Flints?
Yes.
They're great in London.
Yeah,
they're
right.
fantastic. They
Fantastic.
basically come from theatre background,
Correct, yes.
so you can imagine.
They have no fear.
Well,
Well,
they
do.
didn't show it. They didn't show it. It was
That's-
really.
yeah.
They were amazing. Anyway, please ask if you've got any.
Does anyone have any questions while we're watching it in the background?
Can I just ask where you got your optical glass? Who was this?
I actually got it. The company who did the subsurface etching, I don't think they do it anymore, because I wanted to get some more done recently, and he hasn't replied to my emails. But I got it done in Paris, outside of Paris, at that time. I mean, that was 2007, so it was a while ago, and he got it from China. There are cities and towns in China, as you can imagine, who just have,
They seem to know what to do. Is that you in the background on the other floor?
I am. I'm doing this.
I'm wondering how they
I know,
getting
I
this
was
together.
kind of
That's impossible.
Yeah.
How are they
No,
reading the artist's mind? But I can see you
I
now.
was actually up and down and round quite a
You're
lot.
conducting from a side.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Tried not to point too much.
Yes. I can see you dashing up.
Well observed.
Fantastic.
Anyway, I just thought it'd be interesting because one of the students took the film and it's been quite useful to have.
Oh.
They missed us at a very critical point. They slept in, poor things, but there was a bit when the stuff went up from the side that they missed. They got a lot of this, as you can see.
Construction engineers, everybody is be concentrating on that. How the heck are they?
Well,
what are they looking at to process this artist's vision?
I mean, I have to say that I measured out each of those strings myself. Had to do it. You have to be very careful once you take string off a coil because it goes a bit crazy.
Yes, I see. The process done with the fish wire.
Yeah, it's actually stained steel.
Oh.
Yeah, had to be for that length of time.
Of course, yes.
The £25
I was
breaking
just going to
point
say that.
etched in my mind. I mean, the
Wonderful.
piece at the top is the weight of the car.
So you had a team talk with everybody of how you were going to.
Yeah, no engineers involved.
Right, of course.
Anyway.
Wonderful.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I'm curious about your thought process when you're working on different projects. Do you have a specific meaning you want to convey to the viewers of your art pieces when you're making them, or is it really up to their own interpretations?
Well, I think I really go through an awful lot of thinking before, and I suppose in a way that's why I wanted to show you today some of the process making, because the end piece can look devoid of that in a way. It's not there, is it? It's kind of like it's honed down and edited, and I suppose I want. You can never really anticipate what somebody's going to think or say, and not everybody likes things, you know. I mean, or they don't feel strongly about them. It's just. I hope that they allow people to enter into them, like stand underneath them, be part of it. They in a way they draw it together. They hold the whole thing together. They complete it. This is a piece I made for Anglia Ruskin. I actually made a piece a very long time ago in St Andrews at the Crawford Arts Centre, made of lots of discs, rather like the advertising ones, and I was able to take that idea, which was in the 80s, and make this piece when I got a large budget. And this is Anglia Ruskin University, yeah. And it's affected by the wind. So it's the wind that moves it. Some people think they're big TV screens, but they're not. They're just squares of anodized aluminium. And because Cambridge is so flat and so windy, it really kind of circulates around. And the staff actually say when they come out, some of them are saying to me that the admin staff have their office quite nearby, and sometimes if it's a nice windy day, they go out and have a cigarette and watch it. And so I'm told. And I quite like the idea that it has a kind of cultural kind of significance to people. They'll go out and watch that and get their viewpoint on how the work is behaving that day. So it's kind of making the invisible visible, I suppose.
You keep it a close secret, or do you document the whole process from an engineer? If somebody had to replicate that from another side of the world.
At the end of a commission, you usually have to give a what happens if report in terms of, and you have to give them spare squares or spare this and that and the other, and all the rest of it. It's quite a lot of work.
Premature applause there.
I don't know if I fully
Couple of
answered your
minutes, of course,
question.
yeah.
I don't actually
No,
know.
no.
I hope they kind of interact with it. But you know, when we were putting the piece up in Inverness, a very angry neighbour came out and said it was an abomination. So you know, there you go.
Emily.
Hi, Annie. I just had a quick question about just this process of people being invisible. And you remember that resounding piece. I imagine there's a lot of drawings behind that.
Yeah.
Have you ever exhibited that process, that part of the process, like the drawing thinking that goes before these big pieces?
Well, it's such an important part of it. In lockdown, all I do was draw, and I haven't even shown that, but you kindly put that drawing up in the show. So yeah, I mean, the drawing perhaps shows the thinking, the intentions. I've got lots and lots and lots and lots, and I get rolls of graph paper. And even though I work with Rodrigo to do the 3D modelling, I work it all out. I get all the lengths. I have to do it in an analogue way. I just cannot see it unless I can actually work it out. And that's part of a kind of process that needs to be done. And I love Tipex, and I love putting things on and taking them off. And I just think it's great. When we were at Glasgow School of Art, we were taught to draw. We had drawing. We all had to go, and that whole kind of drawing, that you lady, weren't you saying about drawing earlier on and looking, but I think it's so important spatially to kind of configure things and to draw it for yourself. And then I give it to somebody who can tech it all up, and I can work with them. I never give it over to somebody. I'm always there on people's side by side. But yes, there's an awful lot of drawing. And I value them because they're my thinking aloud,
I'm asking because I sort of just want to see that exhibition. Maybe you can inspire someone to help you do that.
Well, they're not very well. They're just rolled up, and they're not. But sometimes I unroll them. But they've got a lot of tension in the roll, so to speak. They're all underneath. Yeah. It'd be nice to show them.
I'm impressed with these massive installations, but what was the first piece you exhibited, just to take you back to the first thing you put in public display?
Oh, well, I can't really remember, but I think I used to knit a lot when I was a kid. Caf Fasat was very big then, Caf Fasat, whatever, and I was sort of busy doing my thing, and so I used to make hats for people, which I sort of thought of as an exhibition. I didn't think of it being a grand exhibition. I just thought I was making things for people's skull caps, for people's heads, and they were walking around Edinburgh with pink and lurex hats on, which was, in the 70s was sort of not quite acceptable, So that was my first memory of exhibiting, I think. But then things like, which was great, the SSAH and all of those things, the collective in Edinburgh. I went over to Belfast, did an MA with Alistair McLennan, who's an alumni from here. And so we went to New York, we watched him perform, we did our little thing on the side in New York, inspired by the fact that you could do anything at any time, anywhere. We went on I just don't think that one should wait for opportunities. I think you just make them. I suppose was always at the root of my thinking. I don't know why it was. I think I was just very stubborn as a child.
I was just going to ask, you've obviously gained a lot from observing and speaking to scientists, and I wonder to what extent you feel they have benefited from those collaborations too, and is that important to you in your work?
Well, sometimes I ask them. I asked Morton, and he's always very effusive in his own way. And we're still ongoing after 20 years, so I suppose something's right. I'm not quite sure what he just thinks. Well, he wouldn't make the things I do, even if I'm working with some of his research. But we have done work which is a little bit more edgy, in the sense that we got data from somebody in the throes of having an orgasm. So we 3D modelled that, and I showed it at the Royal Academy in London, and it ended up in the architectural department rather than in the art one, which I was a bit. And when so I thought that's interesting. I always seem to end up in the architecture, so maybe it's something to do with space, and so that's one thing. He's very fluid and open, and some of the other scientists have just said, like with the sense piece. Somebody at Oxford University said that they looked along it and they could see how all the parts would join together in that kind of vantage point, and that they could never see that clearly. I mean, that was made 20 years ago, so they probably could now. You could probably do a virtual reality thing and everything, but in those days you couldn't do that. So I think I give them a kind of perspective perhaps on their own some of their own research. But I think I bring quite a lot to the table, I hope, because I think it's a discussion and a dialogue, and I certainly don't go, oh, you're doing that, I'm going to just do that. We have a discussion, and it seems whatever's relevant, you know. And it is very open. And Morton and I walk around together. We don't do this and talk to each other. We walk side by side. And he'll be saying something like, oh, well, you know what's happening right now is our small brains are engaged, so we can think of higher thoughts. And I don't want to. Let's just go and look at the lake. And he's discovered that picture that I put up of him and his research group, and I'm in it. He's discovered drones, so we get this different vantage point, and we're going to go out this summer and hopefully do some drone work. But in Oxford, where he's based, there's so many buildings that have these kind of edges that if a drone goes near it, it starts to beep. So there's all that kind of security thing going on, which I think he secretly quite enjoys. He's subversive, but not everybody I've worked with I would work with again, and they probably wouldn't work with me either.
Any final questions?
I remember George Wiley talking about you. George Wiley.
Gosh, that's
Yeah,
nice thought.
It was very interesting talk. He was talking about materials, who would work with what.
Yeah.
And obviously he liked metals and slate and all sorts of things. So have you got a particular material you don't despise or don't deal with or whatever?
I suppose with the world that we're at, the place that we're in right now, it's changed. I feel like if I make anything, I have to be very sure that it needs to be made. And that's why drawing has become so important, and it's just very close, quiet, as far as I'm concerned. If I start casting huge, big this, that, and the other, you know, I'm just thinking of, you know, the quality of the materials and things. I don't think, no, I wouldn't rule anything out in the long run.
And site specifics, you know, you deal in site specific.
Well, sometimes, yeah. Sometimes, yeah. Yeah, I was in. I was in Lewis, and I was casting on the beach there this last year on an RSA residency, and that was beautiful because it was so quiet. I was using my skin-safe silicone on the beach over the.
Sorry, your skin safe.
Well, when I say that, you could use the silicone on your face.
Oh yeah.
So it's so sensitive, it's not going to pollute everything. So I was using that on the beach in Lewis, getting the Lewisian gneiss and
the stone.
Yeah, it was beautiful. It's a really nice moment. I don't quite know what I'm going to do with them, but I've got them as indexes, a sort of fingerprint of that, and they're sitting.
You've got a storage facility ready for this various projects.
Yes, that'd be nice. That would be nice. Yes, it's stacked up. Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's not that glamorous.
Sadly, I think we'll have to draw things to a close, but I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been wonderful, sort of eye-opening.